Clark will never lead the Fever to the playoffs. The words dropped with surgical coldness, slicing through the noise of post-game chatter and embedding themselves in headlines across the sports world. Delivered not as casual criticism but as a declaration, blunt, unforgiving, and absolute. No caveats. No room for doubt. Just a sentence, heavy with conviction, directed at a rookie barely halfway through her first professional season. In a league built on resilience and defiance, this was a challenge issued not in whispers but in thunder. It wasn't the first time Caitlin Clark had faced scrutiny. Her college years, though decorated with records and awards, were shadowed by skepticism. Critics often questioned her physicality, her defense, her ability to adapt beyond the NCAA spotlight. But this statement was different. It didn't question her game, it condemned her leadership. It didn't critique her performance, it erased her potential. The Indiana Fever, historically one of the WNBA's least dominant franchises, had become the canvas for Clark's professional aspirations. A team trapped in a cycle of rebuilding, false starts, and coaching transitions now found itself depending on a 22-year-old to reverse years of stagnation. Expectations weren't just high, they were crushing. And with each missed shot or turnover, voices amplified, dissecting not just her play, but her value. The quote traveled fast. Social media erupted. Talk shows replayed the clip. Analysts debated whether the statement was accurate or out of bounds. Fans rallied to her defense or doubled down on the critique. What began as a press conference comment became a cultural referendum on not just Clark, but what she represented: hype versus substance, popularity versus performance. Yet for Clark, the noise never seemed to penetrate her expression. Her post-game interviews remained composed. Her on-court demeanor, unflinching. She acknowledged the comment publicly only once, brushing it aside with a measured response. But inside the Fever locker room, the words hung like fog, unspoken, yet impossible to ignore. Teammates felt it. Coaches felt it. Opponents saw it in the tightening of shoulders and the urgency of every possession. And the pressure mounted. The Fever's record hovered around mediocrity. Playoff hopes were mathematically plausible but emotionally distant. With every defeat, the quote gained gravity. It became less an insult and more a prophecy inching toward fulfillment. The weight of disproving it settled solely on Clark's shoulders. But beyond the record, something less visible was happening. Games weren't just contests, they were statements. Each possession became an argument against that infamous line. And every time Clark stepped on the court, she wasn't just playing basketball, she was confronting a narrative, refusing to accept it as truth. The intensity of this conflict wasn't confined to stat sheets or standings. It lived in every hesitation before a shot, in every aggressive drive to the rim, in the way opposing crowds cheered when she missed and fell silent when she didn't. It lived in the body language of teammates who believed in her, despite the doubts swirling outside the locker room. The WNBA, long overdue for a polarizing figure with crossover appeal, found itself at a crossroads. Clark wasn't just a player, she had become a symbol. And like all symbols, she invited devotion and disdain in equal measure. The league thrived on her presence, yet demanded she prove herself worthy of it at every turn. No rookie is spared mistakes. Clark had hers. But with each stumble, the critique echoed louder. She'll never lead the Fever to the playoffs. It wasn't just an observation, it was a challenge. One that would define not just her rookie season, but potentially her legacy. This first chapter wasn't written in wins or losses, it was etched in doubt. Doubt that lingered, multiplied, and threatened to consume a season before it could fully bloom. The conflict had been set. A young player burdened with expectation. A team desperate for change. And one sentence, floating in the background, daring her to make it irrelevant. Whether Clark would answer it with numbers or silence, triumph or retreat, no one yet knew. But one truth had become unavoidable: she wasn't just playing for points anymore. She was playing for narrative control, over her team, her reputation, and the story they were all unwillingly part of. When Caitlin Clark disappeared from the court, it wasn't in a blaze of drama or headlines. There were no dramatic collapses or televised breakdowns. Instead, it was subtle at first: a missed game, then another. Rumors trickled in quietly. A sore hip, then an ankle flare-up. Nothing concrete, just whispers. Speculation. A slow fade that quickly turned into absence. And with that, the storm of doubt swelled again. The timing couldn't have been more cruel. The Indiana Fever had begun to show flashes, moments where their offense clicked, where Clark's connection with Kelsey Mitchell seemed to tighten, where hope no longer felt like delusion. Yet even in those brief upticks, the physical wear on Clark's body was visible to the keen observer. Minutes logged at a brutal pace. Defenders leaning on her, bumping her off the ball. The league was adjusting to her, and the toll was mounting. But when the team finally confirmed her injuries, a lingering hip strain and a painful bone spur in her right ankle, it felt less like an update and more like confirmation of an unspoken truth. The pressure was catching up. Not just the physical demands of a condensed season, but the psychological weight of being both the franchise's foundation and its marketing centerpiece. Her jersey outsold veterans. Her face fronted national broadcasts. She was the reason new fans tuned in. And now, she was gone. No official return date was given. No details on her rehab schedule. Just statements from the coaching staff urging patience and prioritizing long-term health. It was the correct response. The responsible one. But it didn't stop the speculation. Every game she missed fed the cynicism. Was she overhyped? Was her body built for the pros? Could the Fever function without her? Could they function with her? For the first time, Clark's name was being associated not with promise, but with fragility. The narrative had begun to twist, and it wasn't waiting for her to catch up. National commentators debated her durability. Anonymous insiders leaked concerns about her readiness for the physicality of the league. Meanwhile, the Fever tried to find identity in her absence, and the results were telling. Viewership dipped. Home attendance softened. The sharp contrast between the Fever with Clark and without her became a talking point in itself. The team, stripped of its primary playmaker and floor general, looked scattered. Not lifeless, but unconvincing. Her influence had been structural, not just statistical. Without her vision, the offense sagged. Without her gravity, the defense overcommit elsewhere. And worst of all, without her, the team no longer scared anyone. Still, within the Fever camp, there was no panic, at least not outwardly. Coaches emphasized process. Players refused to lean on her absence as excuse. Mitchell stepped up as a scorer. Boston anchored the paint with quiet authority. But the void was unmistakable. Clark's silence, both in the media and on the bench, spoke louder than any statement. She was present in spirit, but distant in impact. It was a strange kind of limbo. Neither a crisis nor a calm. Just an extended pause that felt like it might tip either way, toward collapse or renewal. And all the while, that same phrase lingered. Clark will never lead the Fever to the playoffs. Not even on the court, and it still haunted her like a shadow stretching from a place she couldn't reach. Every missed game felt like a data point for the doubters. Every sideline shot of her in street clothes fueled a sense of unraveling. The league, once electric with her arrival, now felt like it was holding its breath. And for Clark, that breathless pause was the cruelest silence of all, not because of what it meant, but because of what it allowed others to say in her place. She wasn't there to respond. Not yet. And in that vacuum, the noise returned, louder, sharper, more certain. This was the middle of the story, not the rise, not the fall. The uneasy silence between both. And in that silence, a player rebuilt her body. A team learned how to survive. And a league waited, not just for her return, but for what it might finally silence in turn. She didn't announce it with flair. There was no cryptic post, no dramatic teaser. No pregame montage hyping her return. Just her name on the lineup sheet, once again. Clark, active. 2 words that altered the tone of an entire night. By the time Caitlin Clark stepped onto the hardwood again, the story had shifted a dozen times in her absence. Analysts had moved on to the MVP race. Fans argued over playoff predictions. And yet, the moment she laced up, the spotlight recoiled back to her like gravity pulling at its source. She didn't need to reclaim the narrative, she was the narrative. The crowd, almost unsure at first, slowly rose as she jogged out for warm-ups. The familiarity of her form, the high dribble, the head-on-a-swivel awareness, settled something unspoken in the building. Her presence didn't erase the tension, but it reminded everyone what had been missing. Not just a shooter, not just a passer, but a presence. A force that didn't demand attention, it absorbed it. From the opening tip, she played like someone who had listened. Not to coaches or trainers, but to the whispers that doubted, the murmurs that questioned, the barbs that declared her unfit. She played with purpose, not frantic, not emotional, but intentional. Every cut sharp, every pass tight, every step measured. And then came the shot. A hesitation at the top of the arc, defender sagging off, baiting the drive. Clark stepped back. Release, fluid, effortless, inevitable. The ball hung in the air for a breath longer than usual, then dropped through cleanly. The arena erupted, not in surprise, but in vindication. She was back. Not reborn, not rebranded. Just back. But it wasn't just the points that shifted the energy. It was her command. She orchestrated possessions with a confidence that didn't exist before the injury. She didn't force shots. She didn't overcorrect. She controlled tempo like a veteran, not a rookie. Her connection with Kelsey Mitchell looked less like a partnership and more like a language only the two of them spoke. Passes found seams that didn't exist. Rotations flowed cleaner. Screens hit harder. The Fever, once scattered, moved like a unit with a singular voice. And that voice was Clark's. What had once been a burden, leading a struggling franchise, was now a choice. She didn't look like someone trying to silence critics. She looked like someone who no longer heard them. Still, the scoreboard was only part of the story. Off the court, cameras zoomed in on her face during timeouts. No fatigue, no grimace, just calm intensity. A player fully present in the moment. The injury hadn't dulled her, it had refined her. Post-game, reporters swarmed. She answered with short, thoughtful responses. No grand speeches. No revenge quotes. But beneath the surface, the message was clear. The time away hadn't weakened her resolve. It had crystallized it. Her teammates said it best. She came back different. Not in mechanics, not in stats, but in authority. Her presence brought structure. With her back, Mitchell found cleaner looks. Boston had more space in the paint. The offense, once improvised, now had rhythm. And rhythm wins games. The Fever did win that night. Convincingly. But it wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was the shift in expectation. For the first time all season, they looked like a team not chasing belief, but commanding it. Clark didn't celebrate wildly. She didn't point to the rafters or the critics. She simply nodded, shook hands, and walked off the court like she'd never left. But everyone watching knew better. The version that returned wasn't the same as the one that limped off weeks before. This chapter wasn't her redemption. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation of the floor, of her narrative, of her place. And in that quiet reclamation, the quote that once haunted her began to sound smaller, less certain, a little out of place. She was leading. And for the first time, no one dared to say otherwise. Caitlin Clark's comeback did more than reignite the Indiana Fever. It reverberated through the entire WNBA ecosystem. Her return was not just about baskets or victories. It was about relevance, about reach, about the sudden realization that the league had in its hands a cultural phenomenon far bigger than one player. The term Clark effect, once used with skepticism, now carried weight measured in sold-out arenas, surging broadcasts, and a new generation of fans who wore jerseys with her name across their shoulders. Her first game back wasn't merely a contest, it was a spectacle. Tickets had been gone for weeks. The resale market spiked with absurd prices, something rarely seen outside of finals matchups. Television networks advertised her return as if it were a heavyweight title fight. And when she stepped onto the floor, cameras followed with obsessive attention, knowing the audience wasn't there for the Fever, they were there for her. The numbers told a story as powerful as her stat lines. Broadcast ratings doubled compared to other WNBA games played the same week. Merchandise sales, which had slowed during her absence, skyrocketed again within hours of her return. The Fever's social media accounts exploded with engagement. Clips of her assists and three-pointers dominated feeds not just in sports media, but in mainstream outlets. She had transcended the game, becoming less an athlete and more a movement. And yet, inside the locker room, Clark refused to entertain the spectacle. To teammates, she was neither savior nor celebrity. She was simply the point guard who made their jobs easier. Kelsey Mitchell spoke candidly after one practice. With her back, the game slows down for everyone. It's not about her points. It's about what she creates for the rest of us. Aaliyah Boston echoed the sentiment, noting that defenses collapsed differently with Clark running the floor, opening space that hadn't been there weeks earlier. But to the league, she was the catalyst they had been waiting for. The WNBA had always thrived on legacy, names like Taurasi, Catchings, Parker. Yet Clark introduced something rare: crossover gravity. She attracted NBA stars courtside, prompted celebrities to tweet about the Fever, and drew comparisons to the seismic arrival of icons in other sports. Even LeBron James, never shy with his opinions, publicly acknowledged her resilience after returning from injury, a nod that only amplified her stature. The Clark effect wasn't just economic or cultural. It had tactical implications too. Opposing teams prepared differently. Defensive schemes tilted toward her the moment she crossed half court. Coaches burned hours in film sessions dissecting how to slow her down. In trying to contain her, they inadvertently gave her teammates opportunities they hadn't seen all season. What was once a weakness, dependence on a rookie, had become a strength. The Fever's balance was restored precisely because of how unbalanced she made the defense look. For the fans, her influence was even deeper. Young girls arrived at arenas with hand-painted signs, some waiting hours just for a glimpse. Parents spoke of their daughters wanting to play basketball for the first time, inspired by her presence. Grassroots leagues reported spikes in enrollment after her debut season. It wasn't hyperbole anymore. It was data, measurable and undeniable. And still, Clark carried herself without indulgence. Asked about the frenzy surrounding her name, she brushed it off with a steady line. It's about winning games. That's it. Yet even as she deflected, the world around her swelled. She had become something rare in sports, a symbol who didn't chase symbolism, a player who didn't seek to be a brand, but whose play demanded she be one anyway. Beyond the hardwood, she was reshaping an entire narrative that women's basketball wasn't just niche, wasn't just a seasonal conversation, but a thriving, expansive enterprise with her at its center. Her critics may have doubted her capacity to lead, but leadership had already taken form, not just in the Fever's huddle, but in arenas, ratings, and the very perception of the league itself. This chapter wasn't about one team anymore. It was about a sport. It was about the sudden realization that the WNBA, often treated as an afterthought, had a superstar capable of bending attention in ways only the rarest athletes ever have. And Caitlin Clark, without fanfare or apology, had become that superstar. The echo of the phrase that once haunted her, "Clark will never lead the Fever to the playoffs," now felt small compared to the roar of what she was already leading, a cultural and financial transformation too vast to deny. And as she walked off the court night after night, crowds swelling in unison, it was clear her impact extended far beyond wins or losses. She was redefining the game itself. When the Indiana Fever clinched their long-awaited playoff berth, the celebration wasn't deafening. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't drenched in confetti or scripted speeches. It was measured, earned, almost quiet, like the steady exhale of a team that had been holding its breath for nearly a decade. And at the center of it all stood Caitlin Clark, not pounding her chest or demanding recognition, but simply nodding, as if to say the work had always been expected. The quote that once defined her season, "Clark will never lead the Fever to the playoffs," was never mentioned inside the locker room. Not by coaches. Not by teammates. Certainly not by Clark herself. Yet its shadow lingered, pushing her every step of the way, shaping the stakes of every possession. And now, with the Fever officially in, that shadow finally dissolved under the brightness of accomplishment. The words had been answered, not with rebuttal, but with reality. Clark's leadership had revealed itself not in soundbites or theatrics, but in the invisible threads of a team that found cohesion through her presence. She had not dominated every stat column. She had not bulldozed through defenders in nightly highlight reels. What she had done was more subtle, more enduring. She had organized chaos. She had made players around her sharper, clearer, more decisive. She had turned a franchise from wandering to purposeful. For the Fever veterans, the moment carried extra weight. Players like Kelsey Mitchell, who had weathered years of frustration, now stood on a stage that felt unreachable not long ago. Mitchell herself admitted afterward, "I've played with great teammates, but Caitlin changes everything. She makes you believe before the game even starts." Boston, too, credited Clark for a kind of energy that lifted even the quietest moments of practice into competitive fire. Beyond the Fever, the league felt the tremor. A rookie leading her team into the postseason was not unprecedented, but the context was different. Clark had arrived under the heaviest spotlight any first-year player had ever carried, with expectations more fitting for a seasoned star than a newcomer. She had stumbled, absorbed the blows, stepped away, then returned stronger. Her path was less about dominance and more about endurance. And endurance, in the professional world, often speaks louder than brilliance. The fans, of course, embraced the narrative arc with fervor. Clips of the clinching game flooded timelines. Commentators replayed her decisive plays, dissecting her every decision. Yet even as the discourse roared, Clark herself stayed understated. She didn't reference the doubters. She didn't offer a monologue of redemption. Her words were spare. "This is just the beginning." And maybe that was the greatest statement of all. Not a boast, not a mic drop, but a reminder that leading isn't about proving critics wrong. It's about making belief contagious. The playoffs, regardless of their outcome, had already delivered what her doubters said she could not. The Fever were back on the stage. A team once dismissed as irrelevant had become a fixture of conversation, both inside the league and beyond. And the player who was supposedly too young, too frail, too overhyped had carried them there, without ever needing to say she would. This story had begun with conflict, with words meant to diminish. It had passed through silence, through injury, through skepticism. It had risen in a return marked not by noise but by composure. It had grown into something larger than basketball itself, a cultural swell, a redefinition of possibility. And in the end, it closed not with retaliation, but with proof. Caitlin Clark never argued with the statement. She never sought to erase it. She simply kept playing until it no longer mattered. And in doing so, she turned the sharpness of doubt into the quietest kind of victory, one that needs no defense, no reply, no explanation. A victory that speaks for itself.